This is by far the most ambitious game Rare has ever created.
There's no endgame? There's no character building? There's no progression?
I am disappointed. I am bamboozled. I am flabbergasted.
In my own opinion, Sea of Thieves is a bad game.
Sea of Thieves was one of the most bare-bones games ever released by a AAA developer. Expectations of a magnificently ambitious game revolving around sailing the seas as pirates was immediately killed with the release of the game. The concept of Sea of Thieves is amazing. Sailing the waters of a huge map with your friends, jumping enemy ships, finding buried treasure, fighting sea monsters, it sounds awesome. And for the first 2 hours, the game really felt special. But unfortunately, after those first 2 hours, you realize how stale the game really was, as gameplay basically boiled down to just doing 3 different missions. Sailing between islands just meant sitting there and talking for 5 to 15 minutes, and when you do get to the island, you're either digging up the easiest to find treasure from a map, killing waves of mindless NPCs by spamming left click, or literally just delivering one item from one NPC to another, which is as fun as it sounds. It was anti-fun. With a game with a concept as cool as Sea of Thieves, the fact that this was pretty much the entire game was boring. And you'd expect to at least be handsomely rewarded for these monotonous quests, but no, your main reward is gold, which can only be exchanged for cosmetics. From my experience, there are essentially 2 incentives to play a game, and that's either from the gameplay itself being fun, which I established it's not, or a reward system worthwhile of your time, i.e. something that actually improves your character, or a ranking system. Sea of Thieves has neither. Its reward system focused solely around cosmetics, and while cosmetics is a reward for plenty of games, it's usually a side reward, not the main objective you're working towards. When both your gameplay and reward system is boring, there's no reason to play. A fact that became very apparent not too long after the game was released. However, determined to not let their game die, Rare has been updating their game ever since, effectively breathing life back into Sea of Thieves. Undoubtedly, my favorite part of the game that's been in it since day one has been that adventurous feel that very few games successfully accomplish. As bad as the initial release of the game was, this was its biggest highlight. Finding a flock of seagulls to find a sunken ship with a map and a bottle that led to treasure was fun and creative. However, with such little to the world, something like this hardly ever occurred on release. But as more content has been added, the opportunity to go on these unplanned quests has created the feeling of exploration that has rejuvenated this game. Everything is so seamless. When things are going well, when you're adventuring from one event to the next, this is when Sea of Thieves is at its best in my opinion. Compared to now, it's almost like the game on release was just a beta test. So many things have been added. Megalodons attack your ship out of nowhere, you can raid skeleton forts, fight the bosses of this universe, and skeleton ships give life to an often lonely world. It gave me the sense of a freestyle adventure. So many games build a linear and predictable story for you to complete, but when you're writing it yourself, you never know what's gonna happen next. For the first 20 hours, the game really felt special. Wait. Didn't I just say that? And for the first 2 hours, the game really felt special. Oh yeah, I did. And I think it's because even after all these updates, Sea of Thieves still falls short in the same way it did on release. You see, once you discover most of what the world has to offer, you realize that Rare didn't actually fix much. Don't get me wrong, obviously there's been a great deal of content added. But similar to how on release, the first 2 hours were amazing, but quickly got stale afterwards, the same thing applies here. Rather than fix the core mechanics that made the game feel so lackluster, Rare instead added enough content to essentially extend those first 2 hours to 20-ish hours instead. When you really sink your teeth into the game, you realize how the actual gameplay itself is boring. I listed off what I felt made this game so great, but when you really look at it, the majority of it actually gets stale after around the first 2 to 3 times it happens. And because the combat system never changed, every fort, world event, or unique fight basically just boils down to spamming left click over and over again. However, even though the monotonous gameplay was apparent, it was masked by how exciting every new area felt to explore. But once you've done everything at least once, because the actual gameplay is so stale and the exhilaration of a new experience is no longer there, the game loses its magic. Interestingly enough, well, different, Breath of the Wild actually falls into a very similar situation. To an even greater extent than Sea of Thieves, Breath of the Wild is packed with content. Every inch of both the enormous maps feel like there's intent, like there's something there to be discovered. But once I had ventured through most of what Breath of the Wild had to offer, and I had beaten Ganon, I didn't feel any reason to keep playing. To me, the magic of Breath of the Wild comes from traversing this grand open world, discovering the secrets that were left in every corner of the map. It's considered one of the greatest games of all time, yet I would be hesitant to make the claim that the game has much replayability. Once I knew where everything was and where to go next, unfortunately, the game lost my interest. Luckily, that wasn't for about 75 hours. But for Sea of Thieves, that came a lot sooner, and once you've experienced every event at least once or twice, there isn't much left for you to do except grind out your remaining trading company levels, and if you want, PvP. However, increasing your trading company level is either done through mind-numbingly repetitive quests or just playing the game, which I've established becomes less fun over time. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, games are fun when either the gameplay itself is entertaining or the reward for playing is enticing enough. And this is where I think Sea of Thieves needed its biggest changes. In a game like Smash or Spellbreak, the fun comes from its fluid movement and exciting fights. But in Sea of Thieves, your only combat options are to swing a sword with a lot of end frames or use a slow to reload gun. And the majority of the time, you have to fight waves of just the easiest cut and paste NPCs. I don't think I've even died once to these guys. If you didn't get the sub-context, I'm trying to say that the combat, the gameplay is boring, and the reward for all this is just cosmetic based. I think one of the best parts in any game is seeing progression as you become stronger, but in Sea of Thieves, you can't obtain a single item to actually improve yourself. I understand that players can't actually buy stronger weapons as to make it fair for PvP encounters, but that doesn't mean PvE has to be so limited. It would be great if players could use the gold they earn from these quests to buy unique armor and weapons that actually make you objectively stronger. Or even better, find these weapons hidden around the world, or earn them from a very difficult quest. It would make the game feel significantly less one-dimensional, because there's an actual sense of progression. Imagine you find the lair of Cthulhu or a sea dragon and get bodied, but then you go and adventure for new items and you come back with your crew to body it right back. It gives the players something to work for. It's an actual reward system. And while not much can be done with the core mechanics of combat, introducing more creative weapons would not only make fighting more entertaining, but give the players even more of a reason to quest for these weapons. And if Rare is worried about its impact on PvP, then either balance these weapons to make it fair, or introduce creative weapons that only work in PvE scenarios. A sword that sends lightning through enemies to get rid of hordes, or a gun that shoots out blunder bombs would just be fun. It would not only make gameplay more fun, but it gives players an actual visual cue that they are getting stronger. And lastly, in regards to PvE, introduce some more entertaining and powerful enemies. Enemies range from baby mode easy to just having a lot of health and kinda just standing there. And the final change I want to suggest isn't technically a fix to any issue, rather just an idea I think would fit perfectly for this game. At most islands I visit, the most I have to do is solve a puzzle I'd find on the back of a kids menu at a chain restaurant. But I see so much more potential. The islands are vast and visually stunning. The game hints at being so much more. The paintings on the wall, the mysterious statues, broken skeletons, random booby traps. It feels like it could all be this intelligently constructed series of puzzles that lead me to a worthwhile treasure. I love the idea of one of these larger islands being its own version of an escape room. An intricate adventure like that utilizes the entire island would be marvelous. The closest thing to something like that are the planned out limited time adventures and tall tales that are still being put out. And honestly, I find the narrative relatively uninspired. It's hard to actually care about a mission at hand when the story is meaningless. However, at the very least, I do think it keeps the game fresh for its current players. I do feel they fall into the same issues with their core gameplay, but overall, there's still definitely positive additions to the game, just not anything spectacular. Sea of Thieves has laid the groundwork for an amazing game, and while I think that at its best, it is, I know it can be so much more. As much as I critique the game, I had genuine fun for the first 20-30ish hours. And while it's not the best game ever made, it's definitely something special.